Again today the Gemara on Daf Tes, 10 lines down from the top of the Yamid, where it says Amar Rav Papa. Amar Rav Papa.
First of the wide line.
Yeah, first wide line. Okay, this Gemara is going to explain something that was said in the Braise before here regarding the different time periods within the second Beis Hamikdash. In the beginning, when the second Beis Hamikdash was built, it was built in the time of the Persian Empire. Then after that was the Greek Empire, Malchus Yavan. Then came Malchus Raimi, that was together with the Yidden actually originally, with Malchus Chashminoi and Malchus Beis Hordes, and then the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Okay, so this in a total of 420 years. Now here the Gemara will explain how a person can have a cheshbon to know where he's standing. If you write a document, so let's see in the words of the Gemara. Omer Rav Papa said, Itoi haitana v'lo yoda proti kama hava. If the Tana that teaches the years that were mentioned in this Braisa, and he doesn't know where it is, that what number of years are we standing in today? Okay, now what is the Gemara referring to? After the Churban Abayis. So the Tana of this Braisa is telling us when the Churban Abayis was, because they would write a document, and the year they would write in the document would be, it's this and this year from after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So let's say you don't remember exactly what year it is after the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash, and you want to find out what year exactly it is. Now, the Gemara here says that what is he trying to figure out? Prati. That's an important point here. He's only trying to figure out the single digits of what year it is in. In other words, let's say you're 1,000 years after the Churban, so there's the millennium of 1,000 years, and then there's the hundreds of years, the centuries. What century are we in from after the Churban Beis Hamikdash? That is not what the person is trying to figure out, because that's not something that you usually forget. But what could a person forget? What decade are we in after the Churban Beis Hamikdash? And what individual year? For example, is it 1,220 years after the Churban, or 21 years, or 22 years? Is it 32 years? So what we're trying to figure out is the individual number, the prati. How could a person find this out? So says the Gemara, the way to find this out is l'shayle l'safra. Let him ask the scribes that are accustomed in writing documents. They write a get or other documents. Kama kosvi, kama ksiv. What number of year are they writing? And then after you know what number of year they're writing, v'nitvi alayu esrin shnin, and then add in this individual digits of the number that you're trying to figure out, add 20 years to this, umashkichle l'chumre, and you'll find your not. That's the literal translation of l'chumre. It means you're not, but it means you'll find the right number that you're looking for. Now, what does this mean? So Rashi explains, this is based on what it says in the Gemara on the next daf, on Daf Yud, that the Safre, the scribes, when they wrote a star, what number would they write? What number of years would they write in the star? They were counting from the time of the beginning of the Greek Empire, Malchus Yavan. That was their minig, Mezatam Shia. It looks like, I think the Mefarshim say that the Greek Empire, when they took over the world, it was a major revolution, and therefore they began writing in shtaris from the beginning of the Greek Empire, and then it continued for years later that the scribes would write in their shtaris from the Greek Empire. Now, when did the Malchus Yavan begin? So the Gemara said Malchus Yavan began 34 years. If you look on the first line of the Amud, it says it began 34 years into the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. And now the second Beis Hamikdash stood for 420 years. Now there's another detail that Rashi adds here, based on what it says later in the Gemara, that in the beginning, when the Greek Empire took over the world, for the first 6 years, it didn't take over the world yet entirely. It was only after another 6 years that the Greek Empire was dominant over the entire world. Which basically means that when you're writing the date in the Shtaris, based on the Greek Empire, from when do you start? It's from the Greek Empire, which is 40 years into the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay? Because again, they started 34 years, add another 6 years, so that's 40 years into the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. Okay, now if that's the case, since the second Beis Hamikdash stood for 420 years, and you're writing the date from when the Greek Empire began, so that means that the date that this scribe is writing in his star is 380 years before a person that's writing his date in the star that starts from the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash. Right? Because it's the Beis Hamikdash stood for 420 years, and the Greek Empire was from 40 years into the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. So if that's the case, so when you're going to write your star, the date in your star, and it's going to be exactly 20 years after the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash. So for the Greek Empire, so he's going to write the number. It's going to be 400. It's in other words, the point is that it's really the Greek Empire. When you write from the Greek Empire, it's really 400 years off what we write. It should be really 400 years off, but minus 20 years because it's 380 years before we write. If the Greek Empire would be exactly 400 years off from what we write, so then when you're writing 1, he's writing 401. When you're writing 2, he's writing 402. But because the Greek Empire is off not 400 years, but it's 380 years, so therefore you have to take off another 20 years. Or again, what's Lashon the Gemara? Or you have to add, that is. You have to add another 20 years because he's closer to us, another 20 years. It's only 380 years off, not 400 years off. So therefore, the fact that it's close to 400 years off, that doesn't matter, because we're not trying to figure out what century or millennium we are in the time that we're writing in our studies from after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. We're trying to figure out what individual year, the single digits, or the decade of the years that we're in. So therefore, you could look at what the scribe is writing, and you see what individual year he's writing, and ignore what century he's writing, but just look at the individual year, and then add 20 years to that, and you'll know exactly what year we are from the Churban Abayis. That's the cheshbon of the Gemara. Again, in the words of the Gemara, so what do? So, l'shayla l'safra, you ask the scribe what year he's writing in his star, kamaksiv, and then v'nitvi alaya esrin shnin, add 20 years. So when you add 20 years, so instead of him being ahead of you 380 years, so now it matches to him being exactly 400 years ahead. And then he's exactly 400 years ahead. And then the other details of the number that he's writing in the single digit or the decades will be the same as you. And you'll have the exact year of what decade and what individual year of that decade you're standing in after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. To know that this is how you have to calculate it is because it says in the pasuk Zeh Esrim Lishana Beveisecha. Yaakov says to Lavan, I was 20 years in your home. Yeah, so I think Rabbeinu Hananel here says that the remez is that because we're counting from after the Churban Habayis, Churban of the Beis Hamikdash, so in order to know what individual year we're standing in after the Churban Habayis, so you have to add 20 years if you want to make the cheshbon comparing to what the scribes write in their star from the beginning of the time of Malchus Yavam. Okay, now, the same thing comes out in the reverse. Itoi Safra. If the scribe that's writing his star and he counts the number of years that he writes in the star from the beginning of Malchus Yavam, and he is 380 years ahead when he writes, so Neshayla Latana Kama Choshev, let him ask the Tana that's teaching this Braisa, and he counts the years from the Churban Abayis. Let him ask the Tana what is the number of years that he is up to, and then v'niftzar minayu esr shnin, and then he has to minus 20 years, and and he'll know exactly what year to write in the shtar if he wants to write from the time when the Yevanim began their Melucha. So here it's the exact opposite. He's 380 years ahead. So in order to know exactly, if you would be 400 years ahead, so then it would be exactly the same. If you're looking at the individual decade or the individual digit of the decade, so then you don't have to subtract 20 years. But because he's 380 years ahead, so therefore, in order for him to know what decade or what number of year in the decade it is, he has to subtract 20 years. Now, b'simone chasimim for this, that if any person wants to compare to how the scribe writes, he has to add 20 years. And if the scribe wants to learn from the Tana of this Braisa, he has to subtract 20 years. So the simon for that is Safre B'tzira. The Safre, the Sefer, when he writes and he's medactic in writing the words in the Torah, and he sometimes writes missing letters because the way the words are written in the Torah, it's not always written the way we pronounce it. It's written missing letters because it's a chaser. So when the Sefer writes, he takes off certain letters. Similar here, when the Sefer makes his cheshbon, comparing to our cheshbon from after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, he has to deduct 20 years. Tane Teisfa. The Tana teaches Teisfa, which simply means he teaches the Teisefta, which is the Braises, but it also means that he adds, that if we compare to the number of what the Sefer counts from the time of the Yevonim to what we count, so you have to add 20 years in order to know what year we're standing in. Now, a similar thing the Gemara will say regarding another Braisa, this kind of similar kind of cheshbon. Tana de Be'eliyo, Be'eliyo was taught, Sheishes Salofim Shona Have Ha'ilam. The world that exists for 6,000 years. Shnei Alofim Toyu, the first 2,000 years are Toyu, are basically nothingness. Shnei Alofim Teire, then there's 2,000 years that is the time period of the giving of Teire. And then after that begins Shnei Alofim Yemaisa Mashiach, 2,000 years, which is a time period when Mashiach should come. Now, Baveniseinu Sherabu, with all the sins, Yatsu Mehen Mashi Yatsu. From these 2,000 years, that's a time period that Mashiach should have come. Those years have already passed, and we're waiting for Mashiach to come immediately. Well, that's the cheshbon of the 6,000 years that the Eibusha created the world. Okay, so here the Gemara is going to speak about this cheshbon. From when exactly does the Shnei Alofim Teira begin? So the Gemara explains Shnei Alofim Teira me'emes. When does the 2,000 years of Teira begin from? If you'll say that it begins from when the Eibusha gave the Torah, ad hashta, and so the Gemara says no, that can't be. Why? Because ad hashta leka kulahai. Until now, until this time when the Eibusha gives the Torah, or until the end of the 2,000 years of this period of Matan Torah, so you don't have 2,000 years, because the Rechima Einis Bahu, if you make the cheshbon from the beginning of creation until Matan Torah, you'll see that it's not just 2,000 years. It's Trei Alfi, it's 2,000 years, Uprati, the High Alpha, Huda Avoy. And then there's additional years going into the 3,000 of the creation of the world. So it's not exactly 2,000 years. As the Gemara is going to say in a moment, when did Matan Torah take place? 2,000 Beis Alofim Tov Mem Ches, 448 years into creation, which means that you can't say that the Shnei Alofim Torah begins at Matan Torah because you're 448 years into past the first 2,000 years of creation of the world. So from when do you count? Now here in Rashi, this is one of the things that there's a big arichas here, that Rashi has the whole cheshbon of how you come to this number of 2,448 years into creation by the time Matan Torah is. And Rashi goes through the whole cheshbon, mamish, generation after generation, explaining this. Regarding the 10 generations from Adam till Noach, Rashi actually does not specify. Rashi says that from Adam till Noach, if you look at the number of years that it says in the Torah that each generation lived, it comes out to be 1,056 years. And then if you count all the numbers of the years from Noach until Matan Torah, and that includes all the years that it says there, from Noach to Shem, Tar Pachshad, to Shelach, and all the years they have it in the Tar Cheshbon. So if you go through and add up all the numbers, and then the last point is the 210 years that the Yidden were in Mitzrayim, that's another 1,392 years, which together is 2,448 years. That's the cheshbon. So therefore, we can't say that the Shnei Alofim Torah begins at Matan Torah. So when does it begin? Ela mives hanefesh asher asa b'charan. It begins from the time period where it says by Avraham Avinu that he came and brought people to come and recognize Hashem. Now Gemiri, we have a tradition. The Avraham Bahi Shaite Bachamshin V'Tarti Have. Avraham Avinu at that time was 52 years old. So Kama Batzren Meditani Tana, how much is missing from that period of 2,000 years of Torah? Arba Meye V'Arba'am Itmanya Shnin Have. What we're missing is 448 years. If you make the calculation from this time when it says Hanefesh Hashasa B'Charan and Avram is 52 years old until Matan Torah, this is where you get that 448 years. It comes out from that time until Matan Torah to be 448 years. So therefore that means that Matan Torah really begins from Es Hanefesh Hashasa B'Charan by Avram Avinu. Okay, so from here you see that Avram Avinu really begins the inyan of Matan Torah. And in Chassidus this is explained that the Iker inyan of Matan Torah was El Yonim Yered L'Tachteinim, to bring the Eibishter into the world. So that began not only when the Eibishter actually is giving the Yidden the Torah Vayered Havai Al Har Sinai, that was actually in a way the conclusion of this inyan. When Avram Avinu begins bringing the Eibishter in the world, Vayikra Sham Hashem Hashem Kei Leilam, or even before, Sanevesh Hashasa B'Choram, that's when the process of Matan Torah to create the breakthrough of bringing the Eibishter into the world begins. That's the Shnei Alofim Torah. Okay, now in the Shnei Alofim Toyu, this is also an that it's explained in Chassidus that the Eibishter creates a world, and for 2,000 years it's Toyu. If the purpose of creation is for Torah, what's the point of having a world that for 2,000 years is Toyu? There's different things it says about it, but one of the points that it says about this is that if the world would have been created l'chatchila right away with Torah, then the purpose of creation would not be fulfilled. The purpose of creation is that there should be a dira b'tachteinim, in a low world, in a world that is disconnected, and there to reveal Hashem and to bring the Torah into the world. So the world has to exist in this time period of Shnei Alofim Toyu, a world, a tachten, in the condition that this world with a complete concealment of Hashem exists in the world, and then the Torah is given in this world. And then comes the shleimus of it all, which is the period, the Shnei Alofim of Yemei Mashiach. Okay, so now, if you want to make a cheshbon, so now the Gemara says here, again, similar to what we learned before regarding the cheshbon, what's if a person wants to make the cheshbon and count from the end of Shnei Alofim Torah and from the beginning of Shnei Alofim Yemei Mashiach. And you want to know how to count this. What's the calculation? So Omer Rav Papa says, Itoi Tane v'lo yoda prote kama have. If the Tana is counting and he doesn't know, and again, the point here is the prote. We're not talking about trying to figure out what millennium we're in or what century we're in. That's something that you don't forget, or that's something that it's easy to calculate, but you want to know the decade or the individual year of the decade that we're in. So how do you know? So this is what we're talking about over here is, a person wants to count from the beginning of the Shnei Alofim Yemei Mashiach. So how do you count this? Now, when did the beginning of Shnei Alofim Yemei Mashiach begin? So Rashi says it began 172 years after the Chorban of the second Beis HaMikdash. And Rashi makes a cheshbon for this, that if you count from the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim until the end of the Chorban of the second Beis HaMikdash, and then you add another 172 years, it'll come out to be that the years of Shnei Alofim Torah, and then if you have to count all the years from Nefesh Hashasu B'Choran, and you count when they built the Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash was only built 480 years after the Yidden left Mitzrayim, and then you count the years of the first Beis HaMikdash, which is 410 years, then the 70 years of Golos Bavel, 420 years of the second Beis HaMikdash, and then you add another 172 years, that's when the Shnei Alofim Torah ends. So if someone wants to count from the beginning of the 2,000 years, which is the period of Yemei Mashiach, he's basically counting from 172 years after the Chorban of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so, again?
The second one.
Yeah, after the Chorban of the second Beis HaMikdash. So what's if he wants to know in what decade or what individual number of year in that decade he's standing in from the two alofim of Yemei Mashiach? So how does he figure this out? So again, l'shayle l'safre kamiksiv. Let him describe what number of year he's writing. So as we saw before, what the scribes, when they wrote the number of the year in the star, what did they count by? They counted by the year from when the Greek Empire began. And the Greek Empire began 380 years before the Chorban of the second Beis HaMikdash. As we explained before, even though it began really before, but the full shleimus of the Greek Empire began 380 years before the Chorban of the Beis HaMikdash. Which means, how much ahead is that years, counting those years from Shnei Alofim Yemei Mashiach? So they're ahead 380 years, and then also another 172 years after the Chorban of the Beis HaMikdash. So if you add 380, 172, what that means is that they're 552 years ahead of the count, if you want to count from the beginning of Shnei Alofim Yemei Mashiach. So if they're 552 years ahead, if you want to match it, that it should be a round number. How do you match it? Says the Gemara. So what you do is you see what number of years they're counting, and then v'nitvi alei arba'an itmani, then add 48 years, and you'll find the exact decade and the exact number of year that you're standing on. Because if they're 552 years ahead, add another 48 years, and then they'll be 600 years ahead. And then, so they are 600 years ahead, but the century is not what matters to us. You want to know what individual year we're on. And then you'll know exactly the individual year that you're on, just like their years, but they're just 600 years ahead. That's how you count this. That's if you want to find out what year you're in regarding the beginning, starting from counting from the beginning of Yemei Mashiach. And Simonech, a simon for this is Arbaim Ushmaina Ir. The cities of the Levium, there were 48 cities. So over here as well, you add 48 years to the number of years that the scribes count, and you'll know what the cheshbon is of the individual decade and years of the decade that you're in, if you're counting from Yemei Mashiach. And the same thing also in the reverse, like the Gemara said before, Vitoi Safra, if the scribe is making a mistake and he doesn't know exactly what number of the decade or year he's in, Nishayle Latana, let him ask the Tana that's counting from the beginning of Yemei Mashiach, which is 172 years after the Churban, let him ask the Tana Kama Ketani, how much she's counting, where he's holding, and V'nifza Minayu Arba Mishmaina, and let him minus 48 years, and he'll find the exact knot, meaning he'll find the exact year of what decade and what number of year he's on. And Simonech, again, the Gemara gives the same simon that it said before. Safra b'tzire, Taneb Tisfa. A sefer, when he writes the words where he's sometimes missing letters, and therefore by him, if he wants to figure out the number of year that he is in, he has to minus from the years that we count, or that the Tana of this Braisa counts. And the Tana Tesva, the Tana, when he wants to figure out comparing to the Sefer, he has to add 48 years, and then he'll know what year he's standing on. Okay, that's the cheshbon of the Gemara here. So as you see, the main point here is to figure out the individual decade, the individual number of years, comparing these two countings. And the century or the millennium is not relevant, but the main thing is looking at that individual decade. So once you know how much ahead they are, so you know how much to minus or to add, and then you'll figure out what year you're standing on. Another thing to figure out what year we're in. Ravona Bereid Rav Yeshua said, if someone can't figure out what year of the Shemitah are we standing in today, after the Churban. So what do you do? So here Rashi just says that regarding knowing what year of Shemitah we're in today, even though there's no Shemitah Menatayra today, and if a person wants to know, he's in Chutz La'aretz, and the Shemitah that's Negeya is for Shemitah's Ksafim, the fact that when Shemitah comes, it absolves all loans. So today, the Shemitah is only all Midrabanan. So it's still relevant to know what year of Shemitah we're standing in. How do you figure this out? So the point that the Gemara is going to explain here is that once you know what year from the Churban, from the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash we're standing in, you'll be able to make a cheshbon of what year of the Shemitah cycle we're standing in as well. So what do you do? Nitvi chad shata. You have to just add 1 year to the years of Shemitah, and v'nachshav, and then you'll make your cheshbon. Okay, so in other words, once you know what year it is from the Churban Abayis, so basically, from the Churban Abayis, we are standing in the years of Shemitah from Churban Abayis. You just have to add 1 more year, and you'll know exactly what year we're standing in from the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so in other words, the point of here is that we're counting from the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash that it was in the 2nd year of Shemitah. If the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash was on the 1st year of Shemitah, so you have the exact cheshbon. As soon as you know what year we're standing in from the time of the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, so then take that number of years, divide it by 7, all the years, 7, and you'll come and you'll see exactly what year we're standing in now. But because from the Churban Beis HaMikdash, we're only counting from the 2nd year of the cycle of Shemitah, so you have to add 1 more year. Okay, now, so to make it easy to calculate this, the Gemara says that instead of counting 7 years, you can count it much easier. You can count it first by 50 years, which is Yovel. So v'nachshav kloli b'Yovli. First count the general years of Yovel. So if you're counting the years of Yovel, so Yovel is 50 years. So you count 50 years, so you have 100 years, another 100 years, another 100 years. That's how you count the years of the Yovel. And then whatever is remaining after you count the big numbers of the 100 years from the Churban, uprati b'shvui, then you count the individual years of 7 that don't come up to the number 100 that are left. And then there's another detail here though. V'nishkol mimeya trei v'nishdi aproti. So here, what the Gemara is talking about is, as Rashi explains, there's a machlokes about this in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah regarding the years of Yovel. How do you count the years of Yovel? According to the Rabbanon, Yovel is a period of 50 years, and then when do you start the count for the next Yovel? After 50 years, the 51st year begins the count for the next Yovel. According to Rabbi Yehuda, though, the 50th year of Yovel is also the first year of the next Yovel, which means that you really count 49 years. So if you made a cheshbon and you counted the years of Yovel, in order to make it easy, you were counting 100 years. From each 100 years, you have to deduct 2. Because Yovel was really only 49 years, 49 and 49, so you really have to deduct 2 from each one of these 100 years that you counted. So therefore, again, the Gemara here says, what do you do? So v'nishkol mimeya, now you deduct from the 100 years that you counted from the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash today, 2 years. V'nishdi aproti, you add that to the individual 7 years that you were counting. V'nechshavinu leproti b'shvui, and then you count what are the individual years that you have from the 7 years. And now v'yoda kami shani b'shavua, you'll know what year you're standing in Shemitah. And again, as the Gemara said in the beginning, you have to add 1 more year because the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash that you count is the 2nd year from Shemitah, not the 1st year. So therefore, you have to add on 1 more year that it's missing over here. Now, v'simanech, a siman for this, that you have to take from 2 years of the 100 years that you counted and add that. So the siman of those 2 years is kizesh nosayim harav b'kerev. It's the 2 years, the lashon of the pasuk that says here by the hunger, that there were 2 years of hunger in the land. That's the 2 years that you have to take from the 100 years and add. Okay, now there's just one more detail that Rashi explains here. Or another few things that Rashi explains about this is that really the Gemara says that the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash was in the 1st year of the cycle of Shemitah. So why is the Gemara here saying that you have to add a year? The reason is because that year that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in is not counted as one of the years, because the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed on Tisha B'Av, which is already towards the end of the year. So that year we count as a year that's still part of the years where the Beis HaMikdash was standing. So therefore we only count from the years of Churban Abayis from the next year, from the 2nd year of the Shemitah cycle. So therefore you're going to have to add another year. After the whole cheshbon, you add 1 more year to know what year we're standing in Shemitah. Okay, another thing that Rashi brings up over here from the Gemara in Erechim, the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Yehuda's cheshbon of how you make the cheshbonis of Shemitah, the truth is it should come out that the year that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed was actually a Shemitah year, because the 2nd Beis HaMikdash stood 420 years. If you make the cheshbon of 420 years, it should come out that the year of the Churban Abayis was actually a Shemitah year. So Rashi says, the Gemara in Erechim says that you have to deduct 6 years from the years of the Beis HaMikdash standing with the 2nd Beis HaMikdash, because they did not begin keeping the Shemitah and Yovel in the time of the 2nd Beis HaMikdash until 6 years into the building of the 2nd Beis HaMikdash. That's how long it took for Ezra to reconquer Eretz Yisrael. So therefore it comes out that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in the 1st year after Shemitah, not in the actual Shemitah year itself. Rab Chanina said, Acha arba meis l'churban abayis. When it comes to 400 years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Adam, if a person will tell you, Kach Soda, Shava Elef Dinrim B'Dinner Echad, here, buy this property that's worth 1,000 dinner, and you're getting a bargain to buy it just for 1 dinner. Leitikach, do not buy this property. And Rashi says the reason is because Mashiach is about to come. And what are you wasting money on this property if we're going soon to Eretz Yisrael, and even 1 dinner is a waste of money for this. And this, so Rab Chanina, he lived before this period of 400 years after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore he was saying Mashiach is about to come, so don't buy this property. Right? That's how Rashi teaches this. Okay, so if he's saying 400 years after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, what did we say before? That there was Shnei Alofim, Yumayis HaMashiach. There's 2,000 years of Yumayis HaMashiach, which begins 172 years after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. So now he's saying, when it comes to 400 years after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, for sure, it's a time that you shouldn't invest in a property in Galus because Mashiach is going to come. Now the Gemara brings in another brayse where it said a similar thing, but it was a drop different. It was 3 years off. Tana and a brayse we learned, Acha Arba Salofim Umasayim. V'shloishim v'achas shana lebrias olam. When it comes to the time period of 4,000 years and 231 years after the world was created, Im Adam, if a person comes and tells you, Kach lecha sadeh, shava elav dinarim b'dinar echad, here, buy this property that's worth 1,000 dinar for one dinar, al tikach. Do not buy this property. So the same point, but over here, the Gemara points out how much off is it from what Rab Chanina said? My benayi, what's the difference in the number of years? Ikke benayi, the difference is tlas shnin. It only comes out to be a difference of 3 years. The masnite tafia tlas shni. In the cheshbon of what it said in the Braise, it's 3 years ahead of what Rab Chanina said. Because what did it say here? That it's 4,231 years after the world was created. So when was 4,000 years? From beginning of creation? 172 years after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. That's when the Shnei Alaf Yemais HaMashiach begins. If you add another 231 years, you come to 403 years after the Churban HaBayis. So it's 3 years after what Rab Chanina said. Rab Chanina was saying in his time period was right before the 400 years, and the Tana de Braisa was before the 403 years, and he said according to his time period that don't invest in Golas because Mashiach is coming soon. Let it be taken from the Yad Mamish.